Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you can hear me out there. I'm Bill Brown with Brookings Mountain West. I have the pleasure of moderating this group of ne'er-do-wells here. We're going to talk a little pre-election analysis. We're not big on long introductions here at Brookings Mountain West. There are biographical sketches in the profile, but just working to my immediate left here, John Hudak, a senior fellow in governance studies at Brookings. His colleague, Molly Reynolds, a fellow in governance studies. And then we have David Damore, chair of the political science department here at UNLV, and Rob Lang, executive director of Brookings Mountain West. I'm just going to start us off with a few questions, and then we're going to turn to you and get your questions for our panelists on elections here in Nevada, or across the nation, whatever your interests might be. So let me start off with a sort of classic softball question for you all. What are you thinking about today in terms of the election? What's the top thing that's keeping you up at night, that you're anxious to write about, anxious not to write about? You want to start, John?
Sure. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I do have to correct Bill, or not, I guess not correct Bill, but add a little bit to Bill's introduction. He introduced Molly as a fellow in governance studies, which is accurate, but
That's
starting January 1st, Molly will be promoted to senior fellow in governance studies, which is very exciting. What's keeping me up at night? Keeping me up at night is fears that my predictive value from 2016 repeats itself. But in reality, one of the things I'm really looking at for this election is to see whether likely voter models are matching up with what voter turnout looks like. We had some disconnect between likely voter models or expectations about who was turning out and where in 2016. That in large part, or in part explained why polling in Wisconsin in particular was so far off. Though I do think that polling errors in 2016 were exaggerated by media. There were obviously errors, and I'm curious what will happen this year. Voter turnout models fail or likely voter models rather fail when voter turnout does something unexpected. And we have a lot of reasons to think that there might be some unexpected things happening this year. Enthusiasm among women. Opposition to the president's agenda by Latinos. The youth vote, which could expand in this election or it could not. In a state like Florida, there are tens of thousands of displaced Puerto Ricans from Hurricane Maria who were not able to participate in congressional elections when they lived in Puerto Rico. But as soon as they have an address in Florida, they can vote in congressional elections, or in all elections. And so if those forces are acting within states in ways that are non-traditional, then what we know about these likely voter models can fail. Now that said, a good pollster is going to try to estimate these things, but the best way to estimate likely voter models is based on past participation in a congressional district or a state. And so if there are massive changes in the electorate, polling is going to have some challenges and might let us down in a few areas. If there are not massive changes and the electorate looks a lot this year like it did in 2014, then the polling that you're reading today is probably going to be pretty close to accurate in terms of what the results look like.
Great. I will take a shot at this question next. So I would say the thing that I'm paying most attention to is the degree to which, to my mind, we're actually seeing two elections happen next Tuesday. We're seeing an election for the House of Representatives where Democrats are really well positioned to make large gains and potentially take the majority in the House. This is fueled by, in large part, President Trump's unpopularity. It's also fueled by historical norms. We generally see the president's party lose seats in a midterm election. It's also fueled by the set of seats that Republicans in the House currently hold. So there are lots of districts where Republicans hold where the margin in their favor is sort of about 55% that are really vulnerable in a wave election, in an election where things are going to potentially go well for Democratic candidates. At the same time, we have an election we have Senate elections, which are proceeding in a very different direction. And that's largely dictated by the fact that the states where Democrats are defending seats this year, there are many more of them than there are Republican seats, and they include 10 seats in states that Donald Trump won in 2016. Some of these some of these Democratic senators are doing quite well in the polls and are expected to win easily. People like Sherrod Brown in Ohio, Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, Bob Casey in Pennsylvania. So folks who represent some of these states that went from having voted for President Obama to having voted for President Trump in 2016. But then we also have Democrats from states like North Dakota and Missouri and Indiana who are facing a much harder re-election battle. And so that narrative is very different than the one that we're getting and seeing in House races. And so that, trying to kind of square that circle and understand how we can have a set of national political conditions that are producing both of these storylines is a lot of what I've been paying attention to.
I guess what I'm interested most is just to the degree to which the Republican Party has doubled down on its rural get out the vote strategy here. If you go back to the 2012 election, there was a big report that the RNC had put out after that election essentially saying the Republicans' future, they need to moderate, they need to be embracing urban constituencies, particularly Latinos and African Americans. Then of course you select Donald Trump as your nominee and he does just the opposite of that. And now particularly in Nevada, what we've seen is just the degree to which the Republican effort has been really focused on getting and maximizing that turnout in the rural parts of the state. Not necessarily neglecting the urban parts, but certainly making a very, very strong play for the urban part or the rural parts of the state here. And that I think is a very, very interesting dynamic, a very short-term dynamic because you're thinking about sort of the long-term prospects, increased urbanization, increased diversification across the country. Obviously Nevada highlights that and how that sort of plays with the rural-urban differences here. But politicians are obviously most interested in their winning the election in front of them, not necessarily thinking about what's going to come in the long term here. So sort of thinking about that tension with the Republican Party and what this means for 2018 if they end up losing with this strategy, what that's going to mean looking forward to 2020.
So I want to take up a point that John raised about prediction. And, you know, for years the models predicting election outcomes were improving to where by, say, 2012, and when Obama got reelected, you were looking at something better than meteorological forecasting. Like we had better knowledge about a likely vote outcome than we did where, you know, a hurricane would say make landfall. You know, I would take the odds on the political analysis. It had more data points. It didn't have all these, you know, extraneous sorts of, you know, a slight wind blows a hurricane off course and things like that. And going back really many cycles, the last time there was kind of a shock election was '98 during the Clinton impeachment. And so, you know, the Democrats thought they were going to lose House seats and, you know, they were going to lose Senate seats and everything like that, like you do, especially in the second term of a two-term presidency. And instead, they gained, not a lot, but they gained some seats in, I think, both houses. And Newt Gingrich lost his job at the end of that. And then going all the way through to, you know, 2014 even, where everyone knew in advance it was going to be a bloodbath for the Democrats. It turned out to be a bloodbath for the Democrats. The last midterm, you know, the '06 midterm was correctly predicted. And then all of a sudden, 16 happens. And it's like a black swan event. It's the way, you know, on Wall Street where there's confidence in understanding market dynamics sort of wanes after a major crash. And what we're in right now is almost a test of the capacity for us to have absorbed some of the lessons of 16 and to make these adjustments, to understand late surges, which is, there have clearly been, you know, bedeviling the models from the beginning, you know, because what they do is they change all the assumptions about who's likely to come out and vote. So all of this was built on a kind of house of cards, which is, we thought we knew the demographics. You know, no one could really see the level of surge you'd get in some of these Midwestern states or the panhandle of Florida. I'm hoping that no matter what the outcome is, that the predictive models, which would say that the Senate is beyond reach of the Democrats and perhaps a loss of a seat or two in the Senate, and that the Democrats look likely to pick up 30 to 40 seats in the House, that those are high probability outcomes. They're in the mid-80s ranges in both instances, in opposite, as Molly was noting, because of the asymmetric risk that the Democrats have in this particular year, because all the seats seem to be up in states Trump won. If those two come out correctly, in other words, if there's something like a seat or two gain by the Senate, if there's by the Republicans in the Senate, and if correspondingly there's a loss by the numbers in the House that would switch the House, party leadership, then that's actually the predicted outcome. And it would give me a little more confidence for 20 going forward.
Let's talk a little bit about the Senate, since we have a Senate race here. By all sort of measures these days, a close Senate race, one that may or may not have national implications depending on other Senate races, as Molly mentioned. A lot of money being spent in this race, both from within the Silver State and from outside. The usual surrogates have appeared here. The president was up in northern Nevada recently. The vice president was here. President Obama was on campus here not long ago. Vice President Biden was here. Nevada seems to matter in the US Senate. How did that happen? How do we matter so much?
I mean, on one level, part of why there's so much attention on the race here in Nevada this year is because it is one of the two most likely places where Democrats could pick up a seat. So here, and then also in Arizona. And the race here involves obviously an incumbent Republican senator who is vulnerable, whereas the race in Arizona involves a retiring Republican senator. So on one level, if you're the Democrats and you are trying to take advantage of favorable kind of national conditions, but a really difficult Senate map, you look and you say, well, where are the places where we might be able to pick up a seat? And Nevada is one of those. So I think that's a big part of why there's so much attention on the race now. Another thing that I would say in kind of a national political sense is that Senator Heller has his sort of evolution on his relationship with Donald Trump over the course of these first 2 years of the Trump presidency has really, I think, is sort of a microcosm of what a lot of Republicans have gone through. So, in 2017, at various points, Heller came out and said he was opposed to some things Trump wanted to do, like repeal the Affordable Care Act. He had this famous press conference with Governor Sandvold. And then by this point now, he's in kind of a full-throated embrace of Trump because by my read, that's what he thinks he needs to do if he's going to win re-election. And Heller is not the only person who's kind of gone through this kind of fits and starts journey with the president. And so for me, those are just the two big things that kind of suggest why the race has been so important this year.
And Bill, it's the ultimate state for what I call the California test. So California has become the new New York State or Massachusetts. There was a point where at some point in the cycle, every state ends up being, Taxachusetts and is the villain for national elections. In this cycle, it's been California. And most explicitly here, the two statewide candidates that are at the top of their respective tickets in the Senate and the governor's race are basically running against the Golden State, which is interesting because it's a test to see this. We have data that shows that there are many more people born in California that vote in Nevada than there are native Nevadans that vote in Nevada. In fact, it's 3 times the amount in southern Nevada. And at this point, northern Nevada is full of northern Californians who came with Tesla. And so it's unusual to have a state that is so economically dependent on both migratory patterns, economic flows in tourism in the southern part of the state, new flows of really what are tech company transfers and supply chain advantages that the North has exploited as part of the, by the way, plug here, the Brookings Plan for State Economic Development earlier in this decade. And it's interesting to see, can you create a stigma out of a population that is not typically stigmatized, which is the assumption is that the Californians are, eligible US voters, they're not this villainous migration, folks coming up from Central America or something like that. It's not the caravan. And yet they're stigmatized in the sort of, do you really want to become California. What, how scary is that? How scary is it to be California? Apparently, to some, it's quite scary. And then related to this is, I'm looking to see at what point Washoe County looks like Clark County in 2000 or 2002. Because what's happening in Washoe is it's being inundated by Californians. And Californians may leave California and say, in fiscal terms, I'm a conservative, I'd prefer the tax regime in Northern Nevada, the regulatory regime in Nevada, but I come with a lot of the values of California, which include tolerance. If you show up there and you start voting in big numbers, it's a test. If you start to see Washoe County go even, or if Washoe County starts to tilt to the Democrats, and then you add how blue Clark is, because if Clark were its own state, and it could be its own state, it'd be bigger than Nebraska, it would be a blue state at this point, and it would be reliably blue. And so what you're seeing is, I think, if you see an outcome where the Democrats win both seats, and it's driven almost exclusively out of the advantage given by Clark over the objection, if you will, of the rurals, and that Washoe, instead of serving as a swing, starts to just wash out, pun intended, and that it starts to hint that the future of that is blue, because I'll tell you what, if Clark is blue and Washoe is blue, turn out the lights. That's it, Nevada. You're no longer purple, you're blue. And this may be the election that we observe in the future as that pivot point.
And Rob, right, it's more than just Californians, right? The state's demographics are changing in a variety of ways, and we see that in other states too, and that's helping drive this sort of either continuing competitiveness like you have in Nevada, or newer competitiveness that you have in other states. And so it's, a rising Latino population, a good number of young people turning 18 every day. New Americans, particularly in southern Nevada, are changing the dynamics and demographics of this state in a way that just wasn't true 15 years ago. And so that's moving a state like Nevada in that direction. It's also moving states like Texas and Georgia in that direction. There are a lot of reasons why Texas has a competitive Senate race this year, or a somewhat competitive Senate race this year, and Georgia has a competitive governor's race this year. What's not being talked about in those two races is an increasing Latino population in Texas, an increasing African American and Latino population in Georgia, and those demographic changes mean a lot for a given state. And then in addition to that, candidate recruitment is key too. Dean Heller is an incumbent senator. He chose to seek re-election, something Jeff Flake did not do. And so that automatically, or typically I should say, an incumbent seeking re-election means you have a quality candidate. It's not always the case. It certainly is for Senator Heller. And Jackie Rosen is a quality candidate as well. She is certainly newer to national level politics, but she has not made the kinds of mistakes that we have seen other candidates make when they are newer to national level politics, and that goes a long way as well in terms of making this a competitive race. If Democrats nominated a dud, we wouldn't be talking about Nevada in the Senate. Molly and I during lunch were talking about the Virginia Senate race. Tim Kaine is up for re-election. Virginia can be a competitive race. Tim Kaine's been a good senator. He's done well for Virginia. He ran for vice president 2 years ago. Those are things that helped Tim Kaine. The Republicans nominated a white supremacist to run against him. Tim Kaine isn't running for Senate. He's walking back into the Senate. He could have both hands tied. He could be hogtied, and he'd be able to walk into the Senate. That is just a bad move by Republicans in a state that could have been competitive. Democrats and Republicans have not been making, well, I shouldn't say that. They have made some mistakes along the way in the past few cycles, but they have not made that mistake in this cycle.
I just had 2 points to add. First is playing off of Molly's point about this being a sort of, Democrats are defending Trump territory in the Senate race here. Interesting point is that how is Heller even up, right? Because if we go back to the 12 election, right, Obama wins Nevada pretty handily. It's almost 6 points. Heller ekes out about a 12,000 vote win over Shelley Berkeley, largely because of the scandal. So we ended up delivering a split outcome here. Based upon Rob's comments here, you might not think that that's going to be the likely outcome, at least maybe this time we can, but 2022 probably not here. The other point to think about is sort of, you mentioned Heller sort of cozying up to the president here. Think about 2 years ago when Joe Heck in this state at this time, right, early voting. Joe Heck was nowhere to be found. after he famously had the press conference saying, I'm not going to support the president, takes all kinds of heat from the Republican base there. In the last 2 weeks of the election, during early voting, Joe Heck is making no public appearances here. Dean Heller is avoiding that mistake, thinking about he got maybe lucky in 12 here, right? So there's a lot of interesting dynamics that got Dean Heller to this point.
Let's switch for a minute to our gubernatorial race, which, again, by all accounts, could be another close race. A lot of similarities, I think, to the Senate race. The California issues come up, although there's also been a north-south issue raised recently in that race. Are we seeing the end of that myth of one Nevada, finally?
You want to take that one up? I don't think there ever was a one Nevada. I think that was a very, very nicely calculated tagline by the current governor to sort of gloss over those divides a little bit there. But they've always been there. All you have to go is spend about 20 minutes in a legislative building and you'll see those dynamics at work there. This time it's been much more outwardly,
Right.
In terms of, as I mentioned, my first remarks about the nature of that, of how the candidates are running. You have Laxalt last week, and of course tweeting out that stuff out of the Elko Daily paper, a vote, this would be the end of Northern Nevada if Sisolak gets elected there. It's interesting to see very interesting to see how well Sisolak does in Washoe. He spent a ton of time up there. The Clark County Commission has a huge stigma statewide, going back to some of the stuff earlier in the decade here. It would be, that part of the evolution of Nevada here is this, where you can have someone strongly identified with Southern Nevada, be able to go, basically campaign in 2 counties and get enough support in Washoe to offset that rural and then build the base here. I think that's very, very interesting dynamic. And I think that's the fear, right? Moving forward, redistricting's coming up, but this governor will oversee redistricting. There's not a lot you can do with the rural parts of the state. There's just not enough people with the growth down in Southern Nevada. But it certainly is becoming a very, very sort of regional dynamic. It's always been there, but I think it's much more explicit this time.
And I think Sisolak might be in better shape for a crossover. So I think that there's likely voters that are Heller Sisolak more than there would be Rosen Laxalt. That especially when you consider there's a kind of crack in the north now, which is the dynamic head, and he's also a county commissioner of the Tahoe Reno Industrial Center, which is where Tesla is, Google, everything, has a stake in the state government continuing a public investment through tax concession regime to stimulate California business relocation. So Lance Gilman, who's a rock rib Republican, I'm betting anything Lance Gilman is voting for Dean Heller, okay, supports Steve Sisolak. And Story County, although small, but reflects a kind of switch in Washoe in this, in that if you think that your economic fate is tied to an economic development policy that connects you to California, and you even have leadership, including a county commissioner who's also this very charismatic figure up north and has a lot of sway, saying, I'm with Sisolak, because what Sisolak's promising is, I'm going to maintain the governor's office of economic development. And what Laxalt is saying is, I'm going to do a thorough review. It might be, and there's a kind of deeply conservative view, this is picking winners. This is, socialism. This is, well, if you're a Lance Gilman, this is the kind of socialism you like, because this socialism built your private empire. And so there's so much complexity emerging in the state right now, where I could see a point where there's so much penetration of Washoe County and the northern parts of the state, and so much linkage and so much identity with the success of Northern California, that you're beginning to erode some of that old split, where both parts of Nevada are now integrated into California. By the way, Phoenix is integrated into California too. It's not, there's a lot of Californians there, there's a lot of Midwesterners there, but what's happened is that the ex-Californians who wind up in Colorado and Oregon and places like that end up reflecting a kind of Western reverse migration back into the interior West that changes some of the dynamics of the states, along with diversification. Now, as this was pointed out by John, there's a lot of migration from California, when you look at it, that's now majority-minority migration. So the typical pattern in 1990 would be that a non-Hispanic white would move from California to Nevada, and probably be a lot more conservative than the sending state in that they've rejected California, or they think they're going to do it over again. We're going to get it right this time. We're going to build better freeways or whatever. But the new sort of flow from California now, what else could you get from California but diversity? And so it's diversifying the West, it's diversifying Nevada in particular, and I think 10 years ago it might have been true that the North was distinct in that it was not a recipient of anything like that migration. The North is booming with this migration. They have their boom, we have our boom. They have their Californians, we have our Californians. The majority of surrendered licenses up there, which calculates the most immediate sense of where people are coming from, are out of Northern California counties. And as we've traditionally had out of Southern California counties. So I see the North-South divide now almost penetrating the sort of, do you have a stake in the way the state's been developing post its deep recession? And if you think that's a path for advancement, then you might be a Sisolak voter even in Northern Nevada. But you'll still pull the lever, as they used to say in the old days before you had to push the buttons, for Heller, because he's still your guy. He's still a Northerner.
Just really quickly, I really like the Nevada governor's race for sort of a unique reason. It's a competitive race that's really boring. And it reminds me how boring politics can be very refreshing. This is a race between two men who are, frankly, boring white guys, who are talking about the state's economic future. They're talking about issues that matter to the pocketbooks of voters. You don't have a race with a white supremacist or someone who's tweeting things that are vile and inappropriate, or a Democrat who's calling liberals idiots. This is just a very traditional political race, which I think we often forget can happen these days. And I think there are a lot of people in a lot of states, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, North Dakota, who would love to have a competitive but boring race going on in their state, but they are not afforded the benefit that you guys are afforded.
John, I do want to add one point to that. What does make this race unique is we do have a governor's race.
No, that's
Typically, we anoint in this state
Yep.
governors, so the fact that you do have, and in the case of Laxalt, a much more sort of ideologically diverse candidate. Usually, Sisolak's very much in the traditional sort of middle of the road, pro-business governors we've had for decades now. The fact that you actually have a governor is sort of unique to Nevada.
One other thing that I will say from just sort of having observed this race on the ground is that there's a whole series of ads that talk about how if Adam Laxalt became governor, he would take away people's protections for pre-existing conditions, which is just the latest in a long line of data points for me that show how much the election of 2018 is being fought about healthcare. Yeah. I mean, I expect that the Senate race is about healthcare. I expect the House races to be about healthcare, but the degree to which that issue, particularly being used by Democrats against Republicans, has kind of just permeated everything in American politics this year, particularly after Democrats spent in large part 8 years running away from the Affordable Care Act. So after it was passed, lots of Democrats in vulnerable places wanted very little to do with the law. They thought that it didn't help them. They didn't want to talk about it. And that we've really seen a sea change, and that the Nevada governor's race is just part of that overall picture is really interesting for me to watch.
Yeah, Gina Titus lost her House seat probably due to that vote.
I think that's right.
Yeah, I was going to say there are a lot of former members of Congress now collecting congressional pensions who are probably floored that Democrats are running on Obamacare this year when 8 years ago they were getting slaughtered.
And they're doing so overwhelmingly and at the expense of other issues. So if you look at data on the issues that are being talked about in advertisements run by Democratic congressional candidates across the country, healthcare swamps everything else. It's surely swamps talking about President Trump. And it's the most frequent issue, and as in these last couple of weeks of the campaign, it's what folks have really chosen to emphasize and talk about. And so it really has become what this election is about, at least in terms of the narrative beyond.
And they finally have the right message, which is when they were selling Obamacare, it was this complicated Romney-like, technical thing. Now it's down to pre-existing conditions. And that pre-existing conditions, protecting them, that's more popular in public polling than Christmas. Because there's a sense, but for the grace of God go I. Anyone could know somebody, most people know somebody or have a pre-existing condition. And the Republicans are now so worried about this, they're pretending they're for it. But if you look deeper, what they're for is your right with a pre-existing condition to still purchase insurance at a market rate, where you're not protected in the sense that the Democrats have said insurance companies are prohibited from escalating your costs to where you really literally can't afford insurance, because if they do a market calculation of your risk and you don't have that risk patterned over everybody else, but it's your specific risk, it's nearly impossible to get that insurance. Or they say that one pre-existing condition you have can't be covered, but you're not denied health insurance and things of that. And the Democrats are not playing that game. They are saying, if you have a pre-existing condition, you will be treated as though you do not have a pre-existing condition in terms of the healthcare markets. And this has rattled everyone. And the Democrats succeed in the House, the pre-existing conditions are safe for all time. Because it's going to be like another third rail of American politics. We've ran that Social Security election in '64 with Goldwater, and that didn't work out. This is the same kind of thing. This will secure it for all time. If the Democrats take the House, because it'll be what got them there, and at the top of the list will be pre-existing conditions.
And part of the reason healthcare is so dominant is, of course, that it's important to a lot of Americans. It's an issue that, at least on the Democratic side, as Rob said, they are actually able to message something that voters can understand, which they were not able to do under President Obama at all, largely because of him. But it's also an issue displacement situation. So there are issues that Republicans oftentimes would have as go-tos to talk about that the president has turned upside down, and that can be for better or worse. But at Brookings, we did something the past few years called the Primaries Project, where we did exit polling in congressional primaries. That hasn't been done before. We put 20 polls into 17 states, and we asked about a variety of issues. And one of the issues we talked about, for instance, was trade. And what's happened over the past 2 years, since 2016, is that Democrats are now very strong free trade advocates, and Republicans are protectionists among primary voters, at least among the primary voters that we polled. Now, free trade was always a go-to issue for Republicans, but now you have a situation where if a Republican wants to run on that issue and really slam a Democrat on it, and there are a lot of opportunities in this country to do that, they can't do that because they're going to irritate the president. And the president's wrath, particularly on social media, but elsewhere, is something a lot of people, Dean Heller included, is trying to avoid. So the president is changing that conversation in very unique ways, I think in part sort of pulling the curtain back a little bit and letting the mass electorate and the Republican Party speak for itself rather than the elites in the Republican Party setting the agenda. But what it does is it sort of throws a Republican playbook out the window, and you're left without that issue, and that's important, and that can transform an election. And then you have Republicans, like I said, not having their traditional playbook, and then also running away from an issue that used to be part of their traditional playbook. Slam Democrats on healthcare, and we're going to win, and they won for a bunch of cycles on that.
Thank you, John. It's an election, so let's talk a little bit about actual voting, which I hope you either all have done or will do. If you haven't, you can
Get
do
out
it.
if you haven't.
It's at the library.
Two doors right
You
there.
can walk over to the Lead Library and vote right here on campus. There was quite a line earlier in the day. Nevada is seeing a significant increase in early voting. I think back in 14, Dave, we had about 300,000 people early vote.
Yeah.
Right now, as of
570,
today,
yeah.
we're probably at 600,000.
Yeah, close to it.
We could get maybe to 1 million people early voting. Is that a phenomenon of this election? Is it the future of voting? Is it?
Well, I mean, obviously, the comparisons in Nevada are hard for the last couple of midterms. 14 was a disaster for the Democrats. No Senate race. Didn't even bother really filling a gubernatorial candidate. Everybody stayed home. Latino voting was really depressed after the failure to get immigration reform over the line. 2010s, you get a split outcome. You have the two Reeds on the ballot. Harry Reid wins. Roy Reed loses badly to Brian Sandoval there. So there's really not point comparison. What's different is obviously competitive races, which bring the resources here. You've obviously seen the Republicans take Nevada much more seriously than in the past in terms of their GOTV. So they've been put a lot of resources into, particularly in the rural counties, into absentee balloting here. So the concern here is for Republicans is this going to sort of cannibalize their traditional rural surge on election day, or are there more voters that they're still going to bring out there? But it's been remarkable to see this kind of turnout here, but a lot of it is just driven by the fact that the resources are here and the races are very competitive. I think that's what's drawing people in. And then something we'll probably talk about a little bit there, you also have, we've talked about the spending in the Senate race, but you also have a $100 million ballot initiative here, which is something we've never seen in Nevada either.
Anybody else on that? Okay. So with this early voting, is that Nevada's taking sort of a national lead in this cycle, but just as a new introduction to elections, relatively speaking, on a national level, is early voting a determinative issue? Does it help you predict outcomes? Is it too soon to tell?
So, I think something that's really important to think about early voting is what early voting looks like in one state is not at all what it might look like in another state, and that from cycle to cycle, even within a state, what early voting looks like may not be the same. And so, and those are often political choices about how long to make to have the early voting period be open. How many early voting sites to have and where to put them is a hugely political choice. And so, there are states where they have chosen to put fewer early voting sites in certain counties over others. And those are decisions that affect how easy it is to access early voting. And so I think, for me at least, it can be often difficult to make comparisons across states and even within states over time, because sometimes we see these changes. It also, early voting as a phenomenon also has consequences for how different events can affect the outcome of an election. So we often think that sort of specific campaign events their effects don't really persist that far into the future. So something that seems big will happen in the news, and then voters will forget about it 5 days later. And so with early voting, you can have something big that happens right before the start of the early voting period. It impacts some people's votes because they actually do go to vote during the early voting period, but then by election day, it sort of faded from people's consciousness. And so one thing that early voting does is it basically extends what constitutes election day, and as a result can expand the number of issues that might actually play a role towards the end of the cycle.
You now get a September surprise, along with the October surprise.
And just to put Molly's in context in Nevada, right? So when the vice president was in Carson City, and I think Lindsey Graham made the same pitch there, it was all about Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh was the mobilizer. That most people have already forgotten about the Kavanaugh hearings there, but the Republicans, we got that judge through. That's important. So they're trying to sort of
to activate that, so people don't forget that was something that they might have cared a lot about when it was
72
happening.
hours before.
There's a few issues that I don't think it's necessarily predictive of outcomes. I mean, you can see a lot of Democrats voting. Democrats tend to vote for Democrats, et cetera. But as Molly said, what happens in one state doesn't necessarily impact what early voting means in another state. I think it signals enthusiasm. That I think is sort of obvious. We have a lot of enthusiastic voters this year. They're eager to get out and vote. I think it also suggests ground games that are effective, whether they are internal to campaigns or more frequently because of external organizations working on this. But there's another force that I'm sort of curious about, and I have no evidence either way on this, but I'm interested in pollsters who are going to ask about this in the future, and that is, for about 8 years, 8 to 10 years, Democrats have really ramped up their messaging about the threat to an individual's access to the polls. They haven't done as much, I think, as the party would like them to about some of the issues that Molly talked about. Some states and some secretaries of state closing polling stations in predominantly minority precincts and in neighborhoods and cities, at least early voting precincts. There is a lot that secretaries of state and other voting administrators can do to manipulate voting patterns and to make it more challenging for people to access the ballot box. That messaging, I'm curious if that has finally caught on. And so people think, I'm going to go early vote, so if there's a problem, I have time to deal with that. Because if I go on election day and there's a problem, I'm screwed. I'm either filling out a provisional ballot that'll probably never get counted, or I'm not voting at all. And we heard a lot of reports of that happening in 2016 in states like Wisconsin.
In Florida too.
In Florida too, yeah, that's right. And so I'm curious if that messaging has stuck. And part of that early vote, increase in the early vote, is people finally listening. And whether you agree with claims by the Democratic Party or not, it has been a massive messaging campaign from Democrats. And if that catches on, it should have an impact on the levels of early voting in a lot of these states.
How about a local question? We've got ballot measures here in Nevada, two relating to energy that are getting a lot of attention, as well as some others. Any news, does early voting or show anything there yet?
Well, that's bad. I think what's fascinating in the ballot questions is question 3, which passed in 16 with almost 3/4 of the vote. And then with no opposition against it, everything, okay, we're going to deregulate, solar's going to rule the day here. And then here we are 2 years later, and you have a very, very expensive race with a bunch of billionaires fighting it out over that. And my guess is it's probably going to lose after winning so handily in 2016. So I do a little bit of research on ballot measures and looking at when does opposition emerge and how does that matter. And this is a really interesting case of that, because if you looked at those numbers from 16, you would have said this is going to pass easily, but I would be surprised if it passed here. And now you have, of course, question 6, which is a little bit different in the sense it's just sort of raising the renewable portfolio requirements here. But that, I think, is something that people, okay, I can settle that. And then you've also seen on the 3 is it sort of split folks on non-traditional lines. You've had sort of Democrats who are in favor of renewable energy, but saying no, not necessarily in favor of this sort of deregulation. They've gotten a lot of pressure from unions who work with Nevada Energy to come out against it here. But then you have the teachers union siding with Sheldon Adelson in favor of it. So it's been really interesting just to watch the coalitions emerge as they cut across sort of traditional lines.
And could I speak to some of the more obscure ballot questions that I find interesting? 2 and 4 are efforts to limit the size and scope of the sales tax in the state of Nevada. Now, what's interesting is we already have a narrow tax base. We don't really have corporate taxes. We certainly don't have income taxes, and we can't have income taxes. And so one of the most reliable things has been, you know, in addition to land taxes, the sales tax. Now, Southern Nevada produces a ton of reliable taxes, live entertainment, you know, soon to be marijuana, everything, all that. Now, what I'm concerned with is the sales tax is paid uniformly around the state. So if you have something like medical instruments or women's products, you have them in both Reno and Las Vegas, and they're consumed in nearly equal proportion reflective of the population. In other words, there's nothing special about Reno or Las Vegas that would tilt the consumption of those products one way or another. So it ends up being fair across the state. To the extent that you limit the amount of revenue generated out of the sales tax, and if you keep carving out more and more, we're going to become more and more reliant on the taxes we only collect down here. Like the hotel taxes, there's some up north, but nowhere near the tax on live entertainment, which is booming and will boom further with the Raiders Stadium, and so on. So I'm a little concerned that the regional imbalance, which is so evident to any observer, and Dave's a constant observer of this, I'll call him out on it, in terms of the disparities on what we put in by tax share in the South and what is retrieved by way of government expenditure, that we're going to worsen our position if we continue to support these kinds of carve-outs, because what's going to be left is all the stuff that we get taxed on. And it's not even us getting taxed on it. It's that we work in an industry, or a very large share of us work in an industry or in support of an industry, or are employed in the region because the industry is here, that is paying almost every dime of taxes that are the sort of true taxes in Nevada. Why we could get away with moderate amounts of government service and not have an income tax is because of that level of taxation. And we don't get to retain it here. And we're not putting it in our schools here in the land taxes. And we're not putting it, in live entertainment, which is more concentrated than mining in terms of The space that live entertainment occupies in a 109,000 square mile state is about 4 square miles with 90+% production out of the Strip. And yet that is not a privilege tax, which is seen as local, which is seen as that the individual is impacted by providing that live entertainment, the security necessary for all that, doesn't privilege us in any way to have any special claim on that. Literally, all of our key taxes and our Strip is considered a state asset in essence. And because of that, we have to protect the share of taxes generated out of that and broaden the taxes paid by everybody.
Let's turn to you folks now. Our panel's ready to hear some questions or comments. If you just raise your hand, I'd be happy. Sir? Right here?
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the biggest point is the dishonesty in the media and how that affects the whole election. How their dishonesty in trying to sway the election, and then the backlash of the voters who come and vote against them. And so, isn't that the big topic this year?
I think
Is there anything bigger than that this year?
there are a lot of issues that are much more important to the average American voter than perceptions of the media. Healthcare is certainly among them. Basic economic issues are critically important to large swaths of the American public. Among young voters, issues around education, whether it's student loan debt or access to affordable college and in future access to affordable healthcare as well, is critically important. When you start polling, and Gallup does this every year, what the top 20 most important issues are to the average voter, media honesty is not there. And so this has been a very effective political trope by the president to excite his base, and I think he's done a very good job of motivating his base to turn out and certainly to have a transforming opinion about the role of media in our society. But ultimately, that is a fiery message and a motivating factor among a very small minority of voters in this country. Most voters are much more concerned not about the retractions that Fox News has to issue or the retractions that the New York Times has to issue. They care more about whether they can put food on their table, whether their pre-existing condition that their children have are going to be covered, and whether they're going to have a good paying job and their children will have good paying jobs. This kind of messaging can be very effective on either side, depending on what issue is picked up. And I think the issue around media has certainly been one that Republicans have capitalized on.
Let's just say, I just add a couple points on that. My concern also is with the media is that struggling economically, and where that's cut is the information I think voters would be more useful, and that is local government and state government. The coverage of those types of issues, they go down. Everything the president says gets story, the sort of partisan food fight, that gets covered, and it gets spun either way. The concern is if you look at sort of how many people are covering state houses, how many people are covering county commissions, that's where you see the cuts, and that should be the bigger concern. Because those decisions, those elected officials, they make a much bigger impact on you than what President Trump says today or tomorrow or whatever Nancy Pelosi says or does not say. So I think that's another thing to think about here is what's getting covered, and there's a clearly bias, and you look at, there's a saturation of DC, in the state houses are pretty much uncovered for the most part.
Not only do you see less coverage of state and local government, but you also see less coverage in Washington by regional papers and regional outlets. And that sort of takes away the average voter's ability to get a sense of, well, this thing is happening in DC and it matters for my life here in Nevada, it matters for my life in Nebraska, it matters for my life in Missouri, where have you. But there are fewer and fewer reporters who are out there really able to explain exactly how that will work to voters, which is also, I think, a real problem in terms of getting voters the kind of information that they really need to make good decisions rather than, this is the latest thing that Trump said, this is the latest thing. That information is easy to get, and it's that we're taking away the kinds of resources and the kinds of outlets to get the information that's really helpful to voters.
Sir, right here.
So maybe for the two national people here, if the Democrats do well, which I mean, take the House and minimize losses in the Senate, they'll do that because they elected a lot of moderates. Joe Donnelly in Indiana, people like that.
Sure.
So what conclusion does the party draw from that for future elections? Or maybe more importantly, what is the Democratic Party?
That's a very sort of metaphysical question. In terms of the sort of first part of that question, certainly if the Democrats are able to minimize their losses in the Senate, that will involve re-electing a number of Democrats from red states, Joe Donnelly, Heidi Heitkamp, Claire McCaskill, that sort of thing. I think in the House, actually the dominant story of this election for the Democrats has been that Democrats have done a pretty good job of recruiting high-quality candidates that fit the needs and the makeup of the districts that they are running in. And so, yes, you have some very progressive Democrats, but by and large, those folks are being nominated in districts that are calling for very progressive candidates. And so I think that there's a House race in New York over the summer where Joe Crowley, who was in the House Democratic leadership, lost a primary challenge to a young Latina woman named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And I really see that as kind of the exception that proves this overall rule, that Joe Crowley is a white man in his late 50s who represents an extremely diverse congressional district in Queens, and his district had sort of moved away from him demographically, and so they chose a primary challenger who fit the needs of the district better. So that's really what I've seen happening around the country, not that there's any kind of dominant, oh, there's a progressive wing of the party that's ascendant, or we're returning to an emphasis on more moderate candidates. It's really, the Democrats have spent a lot of time trying to find candidates, increasingly veterans. There's a whole class of Democratic veteran candidates, including women veterans who are running this election. And so that's been the story of kind of candidate recruitment for me, and not really it's not an ideological story.
Yeah, I agree. At the primaries project that we've done at Brookings that I was referencing before, we looked at every candidate running for the House of Representatives in the United States. This included serious candidates, and it included not so serious candidates. As long as they filed papers to run and they had a website, we coded that website. And what we found was that establishment Democrats did better on average than progressive Democrats did. And despite that, there were a lot of progressives who won primaries and will eventually go to the House, and there are a lot of establishment Democrats who won primaries and will go to the House. What I think it tells you overall, though, and I think this is what your question was hinting at, is that the Democratic Party, or if the Democratic Party is the party of a litmus test, it will be a minority party. If every Democrat in the United States needs to look like and sound like Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders, there will be far fewer Democrats in the U.S. House and in the U.S. Senate than they would like, than any Democrat would like. I think one example of this for me is the Tennessee Senate race right now. So Bob Corker's retiring from the Senate in Tennessee. The matchup is between a widely viewed on television Republican member of Congress and a former Democratic governor who was wildly successful as governor in terms of the amount of votes he was getting in a red state. I lived there when Phil Bredesen got reelected in 2006, and he carried every county in Tennessee as a pretty moderate Democrat. Phil Bredesen was asked, if you were in the U.S. Senate right now, would you vote for Brett Kavanaugh for confirmation to the Supreme Court? And he said, yes, but senators are privy to information that I'm not privy to, and I don't know if that would be the case if I had access to all of that information. Liberals in Tennessee went insane. They lost their mind. How dare he say that? The reality is that, and then I'm not voting for Phil Bredesen now. If he says something like that about Brett Kavanaugh, I'm not voting for Phil Bredesen. So if they don't vote for Phil Bredesen, they're going to get Marsha Blackburn as a United States Senator. And I am certain Marsha Blackburn does not represent, well, a single Democrat in the state of Tennessee. But these litmus tests that exist, and they exist on both sides for sure, end up clouding a rational voter, right? The rational voter should say, I have candidates to pick from. One of them is going to the United States Senate or to whatever office. Which one aligns with me more ideologically? Who will represent me better in that seat? For every Democrat in the state of Tennessee, or every liberal, I should say, in the state of Tennessee, Phil Bredesen will represent them in Washington better than Marsha Blackburn will. Will he do everything they want every time? No. Who the hell does, right? Unless you're holding that seat, you're not doing the thing you want all the time. And I think the Republicans have gone through this. The Democrats have gone through this. You're seeing it happen this year. I hope for the sanity of both parties that the parties look out and say, hey, we have a few really moderate Republicans who did well in the Northeast. Hey, we had some really moderate Democrats who did well in the South and in the Mountain West. Maybe we shouldn't demand that everyone sounds like Bernie Sanders. And then the parties improve. They get more diverse. They, as Molly said, they're better representing their districts, and that's ultimately what you should want, not some national label and national flag that you're supposed to wrap yourself in as a party.
I see two threads, and I concur with both comments, which is that the Democrats have the progressives now in seats that are so safe. It almost, so if you're a slightly moderate Democrat and you're in Queens, look out, because you can lose that seat. But if you look at where the House would be retaken by the Democrats, it's in places that are suburban, that are even fringe suburban. Like in most of America, the suburbs have varying characteristics. They're not monolithic. The places that are closer to the center city have undergone a transformation to where they're part of blue America now. So closer in suburbs, even in Atlanta or Charlotte, places that are in states that are traditionally conservative. Then the further out you go, you get into a swing region that is the actual space in America that will determine who runs the U.S. House. And this is especially true in the House because it's district by district. It's carved out. Some cases it's gerrymandered, but if it's carved out to create a sort of legitimate district, then it's reflective of that, that transition space of, suburbs into rural areas. And the Democrats did a good job in this cycle of recruiting people appropriate to those spaces. So two kinds of Democrats were successful in the primaries. Very progressive Democrats who ran in places that are so deep blue that regardless of how out of the mainstream those views may be nationally, they're going to represent that district. The Democrats haven't forced that kind of candidate onto the contested space. They did in 2006, the last time they won both the House and the Senate and took back both. They had Jim Webb in Virginia beat Allen. They had Tester. There was they found the recruit they could as part of a 50-state strategy after the failure in 2004 to broaden the base of Democrats. You had the former governor of, a big fan, I know you are, of the former governor of Vermont. What's his name? Dean, the Dean scream. One of the things that John Dean did.
No, Howard Dean.
Howard Dean, pardon me.
John Dean's
I'm getting old. Howard Dean. I knew he was the governor of a small state. But one of the things Howard Dean did was successfully say, we're going to recruit on the basis of the appropriateness by every district and every state. And they found Tester and they found Webb. And that Webb was the actual tipping point for taking the Senate that year. And the Democrats look, to the extent they should take comfort, they're defending an unbelievably unfriendly environment in the Senate. To the extent they should take comfort is they've done an 2006 level of recruitment that might produce the same outcome.
It's also worth noting, if I can jump in,
Yeah, absolutely.
is that expectations drive recruitment.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the expectations of a good cycle bring out,
Yes.
and then you're seeing that in the fundraising numbers as well. That that the Democrats are clobbering the Republicans.
Yeah.
Exactly. So there's a it's not just random that's happening. But your point's well taken.
Yeah, and the one last thing I would say on this is also that one thing that Democrats have done this year that I think is important to keep in mind is they've recruited a really sizable number of very strong women to run for office. So in It's got 70 odd House races that are probably competitive. In about 40% of those, the Democratic candidate is a woman, which is, again, so this is to say that it's not just about kind of matching the ideology and kind of the ideological makeup of a district, but it's also really about kind of matching the tenor of the election and what's happening. And we're seeing so much political engagement across the country by women. And so the idea that, you know, a party went out there and responded to the demands of its voters and got women in some of these races, I think is also on this point.
Speaking of that issue on our state level, David, I don't know if you think it's likely or not, but it's certainly possible that the Nevada state legislature could be the first in the country with majority female members after this election.
Absolutely. And that's something we've been seeing is gradually recycle in Nevada. It's such a small legislature, you can really follow this pretty easily. For a long time, Republicans really struggled with them. They made a strong effort to get women in there. They had some elected, now left there. But yeah, absolutely there. And it's no accident that Susie Lee is running in the swing 3rd district, right? And that's an example of matching a moderate candidate focusing on problem solving, doesn't talk about Donald Trump, talks about education, healthcare, to a district that Trump narrowly won 2 years ago.
And there's the potential for Nevada to join the list of states with 2 female senators, which is not a long list.
Question.
Sir,
Yeah.
right here.
Well, I know Gallup may not be having this issue if it's 20, but what are the chances, or what is the probability, or whatever the number is, of the non-citizens voting in the elections?
0. Next question.
All of you.
They're low, and think about this logically. You can't get people who are eligible to vote. Your vote, your vote is worth something, but it's worth this much in an election, a tiny little. And the chance of getting caught doing a second vote or voting inappropriately, if you're a non-citizen and you're working in the United States and you so far have not been discovered to be a non-citizen, one of the ways to get discovered would be to join some kind of army of ineligible voters. It's not a very good strategy for laying low. And that people voting twice or doing other kinds of fraud, there's very low motivation. Our problem is we don't get a lot of turnout on the people who are just even allowed to vote. We have to beg them to vote. We have to come up with games on TV shows for them to vote. So it's not, there's never been evidence that we're overwhelmed by that.
Last time I was listening.
Just to put this in context, look at how much resources Nevada gets dumped into it every year, every cycle, and we're still below the national average in turnout.
Yeah.
Right here.
Oh, yes, please.
Yeah, speaking of turnout, what do you expect in terms of Latino vote, Latino turnout? And historically, what explains the differences in the Southwest, if you take California, Arizona, Nevada, or Texas? What explains the differences in the Latino involvement?
Basically, it's outreach. One of the things that makes Nevada different than Arizona, low turnout state, Texas is a horribly low turnout state. Nevada, you have 3 things that make it distinct. First, you had Harry Reid sort of seeing the future of what the state was going to look like and starting to invest that. And that really starts in the 2008 early caucuses. That's when there's a real effort. 2010 is important, obviously, for his reelection, but also 2010's the election when you have term limits hit in the legislature, a lot of recruitment of Latino women to run that cycle, and the Latino candidates there, so that helps you get sort of the symbolic representation. The 2 things that matter as well in Nevada are concentrated population. I mean, Democrats have their voters in 2 counties, with most of them in 1. 75% of all registered Democrats are in Clark County in the state. But the secret weapon, the not so secret weapon, of course, is the unions, and particularly the culinary union. Their ability to work the neighborhoods and get those out. I did some precinct level analysis on the 16 race, tying it to Latino share of registered voters at each precinct. And in the precincts where Latinos were 40% of registered voters or more, that made the difference for Cortez Masto and Clinton statewide. That's how important it is for the Democrats here. But what they have in Nevada is really, really hard to replicate In states like Arizona where there's no unions, you don't have a rainmaker like Harry Reid there. Texas, the Democrats have just ignored for so long, and now it's like, oh, we can be competitive here. Well, it's really
Right, and
hard to
actually, and this is an important sort of precursor to your point about the amount of resources that come in, is that because Nevada is competitive, it's a place where the parties want to send the resources.
And
that's
it doesn't cost a ton either.
exactly, and that's one of the things that's been interesting to watch about Texas this cycle, is that as thanks to the Beto O'Rourke candidacy, there's been a lot of enthusiasm among Democrats in Texas. There's more interest in turning out as opposed to a race where you don't think there's any chance you're going to win. So it's hard to mobilize people if they don't think their vote's going to matter. Back to the earlier point.
And then you could pick up some House seats even if he doesn't win the Senate.
Some of those suburban seats in Houston and Dallas may swing and help the Democrats secure the majority, and if he ends up losing statewide there, because the turnout's still going to be better, but it's still going to be, they're going to be a bottom dweller like us.
And that outreach issue goes beyond Latinos too, right? There are two reasons that Doug Jones is the United States Senator from Alabama. One is that he got a really good draw in the Republican primary. The second is that there was unprecedented outreach to African American women in Alabama. But for that, he would not have won that race. And so just outreach to people who don't normally get that kind of access to campaigns is so critically important, whether it's for women, for African Americans, Latinos, young people. It's across the board a really crucial part of elections that a lot of candidates overlook, unfortunately.
And to talk about Doug Jones for a second, to go back to the earlier question, one of the things that's fascinating about Doug Jones is that he was a phenomenally strong recruit for that race, and not because he's terribly conservative on all of his policy positions. He's a pretty vocal in support of abortion rights. He has come out pretty aggressively in favor of Obamacare and that sort of thing. But he was a former attorney who prosecuted a very high-profile hate crime case in Alabama, and so talk about finding someone who sort of fits the mode of the state without necessarily being very conservative ideologically.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, Tester, in, by the way, Montana.
Yeah.
The guy's missing part of his hand due to a childhood industrial accident with meat processing in a state where a lot of industrial accidents involving agriculture happen. So he's not somebody who's forced on Montana. And who is this guy it was simulated in some lab where the Democrats found the perfect mix of components and then spit out a person. This guy is organically from Montana.
Right.
If you get that kind of recruit like you do in the case of Alabama, you've got your best shot, basically.
That said, with John Tester, he is such a perfect candidate. It is as if he was grown in a lab.
It is. If you had to replicate perfect candidates in every state. McCaskill's not bad in Missouri, too. I mean, there's some that are a little further out than Tester, but pretty close. And if it just shows you how, even though these are national elections, even though the consequences are national and which party governs, they really come down to districts and to states and the flavors of these places. It's a very complex country. It requires on-the-ground knowledge of a state like Nevada, and you can't even say the state name wrong, although people have in the past. And it's
including the president,
including the president. It's just interesting to me that despite all of the things that are supposed to homogenize the nation, we're still local.
One quick question. When do we hear about the Republicans?
I'm pretty sure I talked about them a bit. What would you like to hear about the Republicans?
99% Democrat. I've been keeping score.
Okay. What would you like to know about Republicans
Well,
then?
yeah, I thought
I talked about the president's messaging in response to your question in particular.
We've talked about candidates.
Yeah, I talked in detail about the
Also, when
president's
it's a party out
messaging
of
around
power,
media.
Excuse me,
question.
we talked about
Bill,
Senate
Bill,
campaign.
when
and
it's
the
the party
governor
out of
campaign.
power, you tend to focus on the party out of power. So in 2014, if an event would focus very much on the Republicans and their shot at taking the House and the Senate. So what you look to is if a party holds the White House, the next cycle tends to be focused on the capacity of the alternate party, the outside party, regaining any form of power. So it's not uncommon to have a lot of even the media focused on Democrats in a year like this. Man, the media was on the Republicans in 14. The political analysis in Washington was on the Republicans in 14. And when you go back, and it was on in 10 because of the Tea Party movement. So whenever you're the party out of power, the whole question is, will you get it together in this cycle, or will you be banished to obscurity? And it's neither are really fully accurate. You're not going to get banished to obscurity.
Right, and the sort of historical patterns tell us that the party out of power tends to gain seats in the midterms. If we go back to post-World War II, we have 2, maybe 3 elections, midterm elections, in which the president's party actually gained seats. The most recent one was in 2002.
And then 98 too.
And then in 98, which someone mentioned before. And then
And
there's
both had exogenous shocks.
Exactly.
President Bush's leadership after the September 11th attacks and the national backlash against President Clinton's impeachment motivated these unique events. But for those two things happening,
right, and
Clinton would have lost seats in 98 and Bush would have lost seats in 02.
Right, and I think as political scientists, we begin our analysis from sort of what can history and so forth tell us about what to expect. And so that's certainly the case this year in
Yeah,
terms of what
absolutely.
we know about what generally happens.
And in the case of 14, or in the case of midterm, right, we know that the Democrats have struggled to get those voters out.
Yes,
So it's
that-
interesting to see them
Right,
try to take advantage of that sort of in the environment, and that goes in the recruiting and the resources and all that kind of stuff.
Did I see a hand over here? Oh, yes, sir.
So our governor candidates here are not going to have a head-to-head debate going into the election. Is that unusual? Are we seeing fewer debates now? If so, why? And if not, what does that say about either these candidates or the political climate here in Nevada? Just what does it mean?
There are a lot of gubernatorial debates happening across the country. What's fascinated me actually in seeing a lot of them is that they're pretty issue focused. They try to do this at the presidential level. There will be a domestic policy debate, there will be a foreign policy debate, et cetera. But you'll have like a tax policy debate. You'll have a size of government debate at the gubernatorial level. I think it's a real disservice to the citizens of the state, not because a lot of people watch gubernatorial debates, but because a lot of people read about them in the newspapers or see clips on TV, and you get to know candidates' positions on issues that they don't want to talk about a lot of times. And so, I would say it is pretty unique. It's not unheard of. It tends to happen more when you have an incumbent who's refusing to debate an opponent, a challenger rather. In an open seat, it's very uncommon, and it is certainly uncommon this cycle.
At the risk of getting us here through the election day, we're gonna close sort of the public part of this with offering you any last comments or topics we haven't raised. Anybody want a last word?
How
Your
about
action-
predictions?
Oh God, predictions.
Well, you have to come back next week for our post-election event, so.
Molly can make predictions because she's
I'm not
going
going to be here next week for the post-election. No, I'm gonna pass on that opportunity.
I predict there'll be an election.
Yes. Get out and vote if you haven't. Our colleagues will be around. If you haven't had a chance to ask a question or have a comment, we'll be here a little bit afterwards. Thank you all very much for coming. If you have time, join us next week. November 7th, we'll be right here, same time, for a post-election analysis.